The White House has announced that they are parting ways with Steve Bannon, the chief strategist of the Trump administration.
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
Down goes Bannon! Down goes Bannon! What now? What now? Okay, yes. Of course, we're not really sure that we got him. There's an excellent chance he got himself, along with the entire Trump administration. I think that Trump still thinks he's on Apprentice. He has to fire someone every single week.
And almost every single Friday. I mean, Scaramucci was out on a Monday, but everybody else is on a Friday.
Right, I mean, usually in a normal administration, the news cycle starts to die down, and by Friday, there's very little news to cover. But no, with the Trump administration, Friday tends to be a pretty explosive news day, and then the weekend gets even more explosive. So let me give you some background and context on what's going on, because there is a lot of drama, and it's very, very good. Now, let's start from the beginning. The White House released a statement today indicating that they would part ways with Steve Bannon. Sarah Huckabee Sanders released that statement and said, White House Chief of Staff John Kelly and Steve Bannon have mutually agreed today would be Steve's last day. We are grateful for his service and wish him the best. Now, of course, even though Bannon's gone, there are some senior White House officials who are still leaking to the media, and they say that it was not a mutual decision. I'll get to that in just a second. But there has been some foreshadowing of this earlier in the week when Donald Trump gave his super questionable press conference on infrastructure, which quickly devolved on a comment about how white supremacists are bad, just like how people on the left are bad. He did also touch on Steve Bannon, and here's what he had to say.
Feeling about your chief strategist, Mr. Bannon, can you talk about that?
I would echo Maggie's question. Steve Bannon is.
I never spoke to Mr. Bannon about it.
Tell us broadly what do you still have confidence in Steve?
Well, we'll see. And look, I like Mr. Bannon. He's a friend of mine. But Mr. Bannon came on very late, you know that. I went through 17 senators, governors, and I won all the primaries. Mr. Bannon came on very much later than that. And I like him. He's a good man. He is not a racist, I can tell you that. He's a good person. He actually gets a very unfair press in that regard. But we'll see what happens with Mr. Bannon, but he's a good person, and I think the press treats him, frankly, very unfairly.
So at that point, he was already gone. I mean, I mean, Trump is such a madman that there's some chance he would have retained him, but any other president who says, we'll see what happens with that guy.
Right.
That decision's already been made.
Also, it's rumored that it may have happened weeks earlier anyway. 2
weeks ago.
Yeah, he's been there. And also Mr. Bannon.
Yes.
Bannon, Bofannon, Bannon. I mean, it's like you don't, Mr. Bannon. There's such a distance. There's such a.
It's a distance. I also think that that he's a little scared of him, because he has that Breitbart alt-right contingent. And he almost never calls anyone Mr. anything.
Well, if he was scared then.
I know, well, that contingent is going to war. We'll talk about that in a second.
Yes.
But so that's why the context of Steve Bannon's, calling Robert Kuttner the American Prospect and saying the things that he did is fascinating. I'm not sure it's that relevant anymore, but it is fascinating because he said that after Trump said, we'll see about Mr. Bannon.
That's right, exactly. And so there are a lot of factors that kind of played into this eventual outcome, and I want to touch on all of those factors right now. So first of all, everyone knows that Bannon had a very tense relationship with several members of Trump's administration, including Jared Kushner, someone who he believes is this globalist. And by the way, people who write for Breitbart have been criticizing Kushner pretty aggressively. Then there's also Gary Cohn, the National Economic Council director, and then H.R. McMaster. Remember, Bannon used to be part of the National Security Council, and then he was essentially kicked out, and H.R. McMaster had something to do with that. So Bannon has been pretty salty about it since that occurred. Also, a senior administration official said Bannon had resigned on August 7th, but other officials noted that Trump had grown tired of his tactics and behavior and had been plotting ways to oust him. Ultimately, it was Kelly who fired him on Friday. Also, in regard to Trump, there is some indication that he was furious with his chief strategist after he was quoted in an interview with the American Prospect contradicting Trump on North Korea and asserting that Bannon was able to make personal changes at the State Department.
Yeah, so only the president gets to make personnel changes. So when Bannon said, oh, I'm gonna fire this guy, I'm gonna put that person in place, that definitely got under Trump's skin. That touches his ego. That's the most important thing in the world. Again, it's not overly important now that Bannon is out. That's the most important news as to the chronology of this. This whole idea that, Bannon wanted to resign anyway on August 7th, that's the part that's total BS.
Yeah.
Don't ignore that completely. He fought it all the way to the very end, and it appears based on the weight of the reporting that he was fired today, and as a face-saving gesture, they said, yeah, we'll let you call it a resignation, right? But now, ironically, because he was a huge leaker, they're leaking all over the place going, it wasn't a resignation, he got fired. So, I mean, my sense of it, Michael, is that he got, that Trump was, if he hadn't made up his mind, he was super close to it before Bannon gave that disastrous interview.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. That's the irony, is that it came from giving an interview to a fairly liberal publication.
So in a sense, we got him.
Yeah, that's just where I was going with it. And if that wasn't just it was John Kelly coming in, as others have done before John Kelly in Donald, what they call Trump world, doing the same thing. You know, Trump, in that press conference that you just played, Anna, he said things like, we won a lot of primaries. We went through, I don't know what he said about governors, but
right.
I don't know what that meant before Steve Bannon got here. But to Steve Bannon's credit, he did a fantastic job in the general election of knowing exactly where to go and finding out where the people who didn't vote for, in the primaries, didn't vote necessarily in past elections, or were, really just wanted Donald Trump to be there, where they were, and helped target that election. So he was an efficient leader at that time. But as we've seen with Trump, he can dispose of Paul Manafort, who was coming in to clean house and make everything work. If John Kelly thinks he's got a job for the rest of his life, he couldn't be more wrong. So Trump, it's see you later, and that's the end of it with him with these people. Lewandowski, comes in once in a while.
Well, as you saw with my prediction earlier in the week, luckily I think he's going to do it to himself at the end. Okay, Donnie, you're fired. We're done with this, and I resign. But that's for another day. But to your point, Michael, when he talks about all those states that he won without Bannon, that's him saying, remember, it was me.
Yes.
It wasn't Mr.
Right.
Bannon.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so I mean, look, the number one offense in Trump's administration that will get you fired is hurting his ego in any way, shape, or form.
Absolutely.
And if you take credit for anything in Trump's administration, he will find a way to fire you. And I think that definitely played a role in his eventual firing. I also think, though, that there was a fear that, or not just a fear, I think that there's reason to believe that Bannon was one of the leakers. And I don't think that American Prospect interview, look, some outlets reported on that interview as if Bannon pulled a Scaramucci and didn't know that it was not off the record. Bannon's not an idiot. Bannon works in the media. He knew that it was on the record. He knew it was going to get reported. I think that was him flexing his muscle to show Trump, I have a lot of influence in media, right? So
yeah, so that's a really interesting question.
Yeah.
That's a perfectly good hypothesis. I have two other hypotheses which I haven't made up my mind between. One is that sometimes when you know something's going in a certain direction, and I've seen athletes do this a million times, you'll subconsciously throw it, right? And so him going on there, not clarifying that it's off the record and saying all this stuff is a way of going, throwing in the towel, I'm done with this, subconsciously. Possible, I'm not saying that's definite. And I know that that's pop psychology, I get that.
Yeah,
right?
and I don't know that he would have picked the American Prospect to throw the flag in there. Because A, it's not well attended enough, and B, it's the American Prospect.
Yeah, the other thing that he might have done, because he's not as dumb as Trump. Trump wouldn't have thought any of this through. If Trump did this, I'd say, no, he was an idiot, he called the guy and that's it, right?
Yeah.
Is that he knew he was already getting fired. He saw that press conference. He knew that we'll see means you're done. He does this so he has a fig leaf for why he got fired like Scaramucci, as opposed to, you're too racist, you're too this, you're too that, and you were shown the door. This seems like, wow, oh man, I screwed up that one little thing, and then that's why I got fired. But really, otherwise I had it.
Right.
Right. So that's also another possibility. But the most important thing is that stuff doesn't really matter now that he's gone. The most important thing is that he's gone.
He's gone, and what I speculate he's gonna do now that he's gone, I think is way more relevant, right? And look, I know it's only speculation, but people believe that Bannon is gonna go right back to Breitbart. Why wouldn't he?
Yeah.
And he still has a considerable amount of influence over the type of reporting that takes place at Breitbart, which is why they've been so aggressively critical of all the individuals in Trump's administration that Bannon doesn't like and Bannon doesn't get along with.
Yeah, so one more thing. I think the fact that he's gone is great news for the country for several different reasons. Number one is he's the father of the alt-right movement, which is a white nationalist movement. Having that guy in the White House is toxic, and it's great and a great relief to see him gone. The second is that he's way brighter than Trump, and if he had done his exact populist strategy, not policy-wise it would have been a disaster, but politically it had some chance of working. If you went with an economic nationalism, like he told Kuttner at the American Prospect, that it's an ugly form of politics, but one that has potential, especially in a time of populist rage. Now without him, Trump has no chance of pulling that off, and now he's surrounded by Goldman Sachs guys, who the country basically hates. And now he's also taking some of his alt-right base with him, even if they're not going to vote for a Democrat, as a lot of them said they're going to stay home. And that was the problem the Democrats had. So it's just a giant win-win for us and for the country that Bannon's out, because policy-wise they won't go in as bad a direction without his guidance. And politically, I think it's done some serious damage to Trump.
Yeah, that's true. After Reince Priebus left the White House, I spoke to somebody who works at the White House who said to me that there's always a calculation that they make. They sit down, they say, well, how much is this guy or this woman going to hurt us from outside, right? And there was always the fear that Steve Bannon leaves the White House under bad circumstances, and it's bad for the administration because he's going to go out and he's going to just wage war against them and say what the secrets are and et cetera, et cetera. And afterwards today, Bannon gave an interview and he said that he is going to war, but he's going to war with the opponents of the White House, that he is going to spend his time going after the opponents of the White House, which you can believe that he would say today, but watch him in a week, watch him in a month, watch him in 3 months, because most likely he's got a chip on his shoulder about what happened and how it happened, but maybe not. I mean, there is he's lived in the shadows in some respect, and now he's going to come out. I would say you called him the father of the alt-right movement. I'd say he's more the godfather. I'd say he didn't start it, he didn't bring it to Trump, he cultivated what was there. And I think that's even more dangerous because he could do it now again in a different way.
Yeah, I hear you. And he'll of course attack the left. But he and I never had interactions. Actually, we met once at the RNC, but and I'm of course using us as symbolically in terms of of course he doesn't like the left. But he's had 8 months of warfare against Gary Cohn and Jared Kushner and all those guys that he calls globalists, and especially H.R. McMaster. He's going to go to war against them. That's his immediate target.
I agree.
It's like Cersei. We don't have time for the White Walkers. I'm going to go after my opponents in Westeros first. And speaking of White Walkers, boy, with Steve Bannon, you got a hell of a White Walker, and he just walked out of the White House. Yeah. If you like the Young Turks, you'll love Young Turks membership. TYTnetwork.com/join.